Sometimes the peace we find in solitude comes at a price we never saw coming. For 68-year-old Marla, 30 years of quiet mountain living was about to be shattered by a truth that had been waiting beneath her feet all along. The locals called her the Root Woman. She lived alone in a cabin deep in the Smoky Mountains, making her living as an herbalist. Near her front porch sat a massive anthill that she'd learned to respect and avoid over the decades. The strange humming sound it made never quite sounded right, but Marla figured some things were better left alone. Then a storm hit the mountains. When the rain stopped and Marla stepped outside, part of the ancient mound had been torn away. What she discovered underneath wasn't the work of insects. It was something much older, something that had been sleeping beneath her home for generations. What happens when the ground you've trusted for 30 years turns out to be hiding the unthinkable? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Marla had come to these mountains 30 years ago carrying nothing but a worn duffel bag, a heart full of wounds, and hands that knew the healing power of plants. She'd been 38 then, running from a life that had crumbled around her like old leaves. Her marriage had ended badly, her children had grown distant, and the suburban house that once felt like home had become a prison of memories she couldn't bear to face each morning. The realtor in the small mountain town had looked at her with barely concealed skepticism when she'd inquired about the remote cabin. "It's been empty for near on 15 years, he'd warned, adjusting his glasses as he studied her city clothes and soft hands. "No running water, no electricity, and the nearest neighbor is 5 miles down a road that washes out every spring." "You sure you know what you're getting into, ma'am?" Marla had signed the papers that same afternoon. The cabin itself was a testament to mountain craftsmanship from a bygone era. Built from hand-hewn logs and chinked with clay, mixed from the very soil it sat upon, it had weathered decades of harsh winters and humid summers with the stubborn grace of something meant to endure. The previous owner had been an old mountain man named Tobias, who'd lived there alone for 40 years before passing peacefully in his sleep. His belongings had been cleared out, but his spirit seemed to linger in the solid construction and thoughtful details he'd left behind. In those early days, Marla had thrown herself into the work of making the place livable. She'd learned to pump water from the old well, to split wood for the stone fireplace, and to coax light from kerosene lamps when darkness fell early among the towering pines. Her hands, once soft from office work, grew calloused and strong. Her back, accustomed to desk chairs and soft beds, adapted to the physical demands of mountain living. The herb garden had been her first real project. She'd started small, clearing a patch of ground near the southern wall of the cabin where the morning sun lingered longest. Wild ginseng already grew in the surrounding forest, along with golden seal, bloodroot, and dozens of other healing plants that seemed to thrive in the rich mountain soil. Marla had studied herbalism as a hobby back in her old life, but here it became both passion and necessity. She'd built the herb drying rack herself that first autumn, choosing seasoned oak from a fallen tree and carving each joint by hand. The simple structure had become the heart of her operation over the years. Bundles of dried herbs hanging from its wooden arms like aromatic prayer flags, filling the cabin with the earthy sense of healing and home. That rack had seen her through 3 decades of harvests, its wood darkened and smoothed by countless handlings, each season adding to its patina of use and purpose. The townspeople had been wary of her at first. Mountain communities didn't take easily to outsiders, especially women who chose to live alone in places that challenged even experienced men. But word of her knowledge spread slowly through the valley. When old Martha Henning's arthritis flared up something fierce during a particularly harsh winter, her grandson had made the difficult trek to Marla's cabin. The willow bark tea and wintergreen salve had given the old woman her first pain-free sleep in months. After that, they started calling her the Root Woman. It wasn't said with disrespect, but rather with the careful regard mountain folk reserved for those who possessed useful knowledge. She wasn't quite one of them, might never be with her outsider origins and educated way of speaking, but she'd earned a place in their ecosystem of mutual dependence. They brought her their ailments, their questions about plant medicine, and sometimes just their loneliness. In return, she asked for little beyond the occasional bag of flour or can of coffee from their trips to town. The ant hill had been there when she'd arrived, though much smaller then. Situated about 20 yards from her front porch, it had seemed unremarkable at first, just another feature of the mountain landscape she was learning to navigate. But over the years, she'd developed an instinctive wariness of it that she'd never quite been able to explain. It wasn't just the size, though the mound had grown considerably over the decades. What started as a modest bump in the earth had expanded into something nearly 4 feet high and twice as wide, its reddish clay surface smooth and oddly regular in shape. More unsettling was the sound it made, a low, thrumming hum that seemed to emanate from deep within the earth. She'd told herself it was just the sound of a particularly large colony going about its business, but ant hills weren't supposed to sound like that. The hum had a musical quality to it, as if something far below was singing in frequencies just at the edge of human hearing. The local wildlife seemed to share her instinctive caution. In all her years on the mountain, she'd never seen deer graze within 50 yards of the mound. Birds would land on nearby trees, but never on the hill itself. Even her garden cats, fearless hunters who tackle everything from field mice to the occasional snake, gave the area a wide berth. Marla had learned to respect the boundaries that nature seemed to set. She'd built her garden on the opposite side of the cabin, established her compost pile well away from the mysterious mound, and created walking paths that curved around it rather than approaching directly. It had become part of the rhythm of her mountain life. This, a careful dance around something she didn't understand but had learned to live. With her daily routines had evolved around this landscape of caution and respect. Each morning she'd rise before dawn to tend the garden and gather whatever plants the season offered. Spring brought tender shoots of wild ramp and the first delicate leaves of violet. Summer's abundance included echinacea, calendula, and the sweet-scented chamomile that grew wild along the creek. Autumn was harvest time for roots and bark, while winter found her in the cabin, grinding dried herbs and mixing tinctures by lamplight. The evenings were for reading, by the light of oil lamps that cast dancing shadows on the log walls. She'd collected books on botany, herbalism, and mountain folklore over the years, building a library that reflected her growing understanding of the place she'd chosen to call home. Some of the older books, purchased from estate sales and used bookshops, contained references to local legends and traditional knowledge that the mountain people rarely shared with outsiders. It was in one of these old volumes that she'd first encountered mentions of places that should be left alone, sites where the earth itself seemed to hold memories too old and too dangerous for human interference. The book spoke of mounds and ancient gathering places where the old ones had conducted rituals to keep certain forces contained. At the time, she dismissed such passages as quaint folklore, the sort of stories that isolated communities create to explain natural phenomena they don't understand. Now, as she stood, looking at the storm-damaged mound in the grey light of early morning, those half-remembered warnings took on a weight they'd never carried before. The storm had been unlike anything she'd experienced in her 30 years on the mountain. It had rolled in just after sunset, bringing winds that screamed through the pines with a fury that spoke of something more than weather. Lightning had split the sky in brilliant, stuttering displays that turned the forest into a stark landscape of shadows and harsh light. The thunder hadn't been the usual rolling boom of mountain storms, but sharp cracks that seemed to shake the very bones of the earth. She'd huddled in her cabin as the storm raged, listening to trees fall in the distance and feeling the solid log walls shudder with each gust of wind. When morning came, the silence that followed was profound, not the peaceful quiet of a mountain dawn, but the unsettling hush that follows devastation. The damage to her property had been minimal. A few shingles blown from the roof, some broken branches in the garden, and a section of her herb-drying rack that would need repair. But the mound had been torn open, like a wound in the earth. The morning air held the clean scent of rain-washed earth and pine needles. But underneath it lingered something else, a metallic tang that reminded Marla of blood or old copper. She stepped carefully across the storm debris, her weathered boots finding purchase on the wet ground as she surveyed the damage to her small mountain sanctuary. Most of the destruction was what she'd expected. The vegetable garden would need replanting where the wind had stripped the bean poles bare. Her rain barrel had overturned, spilling precious water across the herb beds. But these were familiar problems, the kind that mountain living had taught her to take in stride. What drew her attention with increasing unease was the massive gash that had opened in the side of the anthill. The storm had torn away nearly a third of the mound's surface, creating a ragged opening that revealed the interior structure Marla had never imagined existed beneath the smooth clay exterior. What she could see made no sense, according to everything she thought she knew about ant colonies. Instead of the network of tunnels and chambers she expected, the exposed interior showed something that looked disturbingly artificial. Smooth stones fitted together with the precision of masonry work formed what appeared to be a curved wall disappearing into the earth. The stones were unlike anything she'd seen in the local geology, dark basalt or obsidian that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, carved with shallow grooves that formed patterns too regular to be natural. Marla approached slowly, her heart beating faster with each step. The silence that surrounded the damaged mound felt different from the normal quiet of her mountain mornings. It was a thick, expectant silence, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Even the ever-present birdsongs that usually welcomed each dawn were notably absent. As she drew closer, she could see that the curved wall continued deeper than the storm damage had revealed. What she was looking at appeared to be the outer edge of a much larger structure buried beneath decades of accumulated earth and clay. The realization struck her with cold certainty. This wasn't an anthill at all. It was something else entirely, something that had been deliberately hidden. Kneeling beside the opening, Marla peered into the exposed interior. The morning light penetrated only a few feet into the cavity. But even in that limited visibility, she could make out details that made her stomach tighten with apprehension. The stones weren't just fitted together. They were carved with symbols that looked like no writing system she'd ever encountered. The marks seemed to flow from one stone to the next, creating larger patterns that suggested meaning beyond mere decoration. Something metallic caught the light near the base of the exposed wall. Working carefully to avoid disturbing the structure further, Marla reached into the opening and extracted what appeared to be a disc of tarnished bronze about the size of her palm. The metal was warm to the touch, despite the cool morning air, and its surface was covered with the same strange symbols that marked the stones. The moment her fingers closed around the disc, the familiar humming that had always emanated from the mound changed pitch. The sound deepened, becoming more resonant, as if her discovery had somehow awakened whatever mechanism produced it. Marla jerked her hand back instinctively, but the bronze disc remained clutched in her fingers, its surface growing warmer against her skin. She stood quickly, studying the artifact in the better light away from the opening. The symbols etched into its surface seemed to shift slightly as she turned it, creating an optical illusion that made her eyes water if she stared too long. The bronze itself was unusual, too pure, too perfectly preserved for something that had obviously been buried for decades, or possibly centuries. A movement in her peripheral vision made her look up sharply. For just a moment, she thought she'd seen something pale moving among the trees on the far side of the clearing. But when she focused her attention in that direction, nothing was there except the familiar trunks of pine and oak swaying gently in the morning breeze. The silence, however, had become absolute. No bird songs, no insect buzz, no whisper of small creatures moving through the underbrush. Even the wind seemed to have stilled, leaving the forest wrapped in a quiet so complete it felt unnatural. Marla realized she couldn't remember the last time she'd experienced such profound stillness on the mountain. Where were the animals? In 30 years of mountain living, she'd grown accustomed to the constant presence of wildlife around her cabin. Squirrels chattered in the oak trees, chipmunks raided her bird feeders, and deer regularly grazed in the meadow beyond her garden. Even in winter, when many creatures hibernated or migrated, there were always signs of life, tracks in the snow, the distant call of crows, the rustle of something moving through the forest. Now, nothing. She walked the perimeter of her property, the bronze disc still warm in her hand, searching for any sign of the familiar creatures that should have been stirring with the dawn. The bird feeders she'd filled just 2 days before remained untouched, seeds scattered on the ground below as if the birds had fled in the middle of feeding. Fresh deer tracks led toward her property from multiple directions, but all stopped abruptly at roughly the same distance from the damaged mound, about 50 yards out, forming an almost perfect circle of avoidance. Even her garden cats were nowhere to be seen. Smoke and Pepper, the 2 semi-feral tomcats who'd adopted her cabin as their territory years ago, were usually sprawled on the sunny side of the porch by this time of morning. Their food bowls remained full from the previous evening, untouched despite their normally reliable appetites. The wrongness of it all pressed against her consciousness like a physical weight. This wasn't the temporary disruption that followed normal storms. Animals might take shelter during severe weather, but they returned quickly once the danger passed. This felt like something more fundamental, an abandonment, as if every creature with the sense to recognize danger had decided her property was no longer safe. Returning to the damaged mound, Marla noticed something else that made her skin crawl. The opening created by the storm wasn't entirely dark. Deep within the exposed structure, far below where the morning light could penetrate, there was a faint glow. Not the warm yellow of sunlight or the orange flicker of fire, but a cold, blue-white luminescence that seemed to pulse with the same rhythm as the strange humming. She'd lived on this mountain for 3 decades, had explored every trail and hidden valley within miles of her cabin, had studied the local flora and fauna with the dedication of a true naturalist. She thought she knew this place, understood its moods and seasons, had made peace with its mysteries. But standing here beside this impossible structure with its eerie glow and alien symbols, she felt like a stranger in her own home. The bronze disc pulsed once in her hand, a single warm throb that seemed to synchronize with whatever was producing the light below. Marla nearly dropped it in surprise, but her fingers tightened reflexively around the metal. As they did, the glow from within the structure brightened noticeably, and the humming took on an almost musical quality that raised the hair on her arms. Something was responding to her presence. Something that had been waiting beneath her feet for 30 years was beginning to wake up. Marla backed away from the mound slowly, fighting the urge to run. Whatever this was, whatever she'd unknowingly been living beside all these years, it was beyond anything her practical mountain wisdom had prepared her to handle. But as she retreated toward the safety of her cabin, the bronze disc growing cooler in her loosening grip, one thought echoed through her mind with unsettling clarity. If the animals were smart enough to leave, what did that say about her decision to stay? Inside the safety of her cabin, Marla set the bronze disc on her kitchen table and stared at it as if it might provide answers to questions she didn't know how to ask. The artifact seemed ordinary enough in the familiar surroundings of her home, just a piece of old metal with strange markings, the kind of thing that might turn up at an archaeological dig or in a museum display case. But the memory of its warmth, the way it had seemed to pulse in response to the glow from within the damaged mound, made her reluctant to touch it again. She needed to understand what she was dealing with, and that meant consulting the records she'd been keeping since her arrival on the mountain. Over the years, Marla had developed the habit of documenting everything she observed about her environment, weather patterns, animal behavior, the seasonal cycles of native plants. even her own health and energy levels. What had started as casual notes had evolved into a comprehensive journal of mountain life, filling a dozen notebooks with observations that suddenly seemed far more significant than they had when she'd written them. The journals were stored in a wooden chest beside her reading chair, each volume carefully labeled with dates and organized chronologically. She pulled out the earliest notebook, its pages yellowed and brittle with age, and began searching through 30 years of observations for clues she might have missed at the time. The first entries were exactly what she'd expected, the excited observations of a city woman learning to live in the wilderness. She documented everything with the enthusiasm of someone discovering a new world, the names of wildflowers, the calls of unfamiliar birds, the subtle signs that indicated changing weather. But as she read more carefully, patterns began to emerge that she'd been too inexperienced to recognize when she'd first arrived. Even in those early months, she'd noted the animals' behavior around the anthill. The deer avoid the eastern meadow, she'd written in her second month. They graze right up to within about 50 yards of the mound, then turn away as if they've hit an invisible barrier. At the time, she'd attributed it to some scent marker she couldn't detect, or perhaps the presence of a predator den nearby. By her first winter, she'd documented other oddities. Strangest thing, threw kitchen scraps near the hill, thinking it might attract some wildlife for observation. Came back 3 days later and the food was untouched, even though raccoons and possums had been raiding my compost pile regularly. She'd blamed it on the harsh weather, thinking the animals were too focused on finding shelter to bother with food sources that required them to venture into the open. Year after year, the entries painted a picture of consistent avoidance that Marla had rationalized away at the time. Birds that nested in every tree around her property except those closest to the mound. Insects that swarmed everywhere during certain seasons but left a noticeable gap in their distribution. Even the hardiest weeds and wildflowers seemed reluctant to take root in the immediate vicinity of the hill. More disturbing were the entries that documented sounds she'd dismissed as quirks of mountain acoustics. "The humming is particularly loud tonight," she'd written during her third summer. "Almost musical. Woke me up around midnight with what sounded like harmonic progressions. Must be some interaction between wind and the hill's shape. But I've never heard anything quite like it." The sound had been there from the beginning, but she'd grown so accustomed to it that she'd stopped noting it in her journals after the first few years. Reading her early observations now, she realized how naive she'd been to dismiss something so clearly unusual as a natural phenomenon. But it was an entry from her 7th year that made her hands shake as she read, "Saw lights again last night. Blue-white glow coming from the direction of the hill, visible for maybe 10 minutes around 3 a.m. Second time this month. Probably just phosphorescence from decaying organic matter, though I've never seen it last so long or appear so regularly. Lights. She'd seen the lights 7 years into her residency and had convinced herself they were some sort of natural bioluminescence. But reading about them now, after seeing the same cold glow emanating from within the damaged structure, she understood how desperately she'd wanted to believe in rational explanations for clearly irrational phenomena. Marla flipped through more recent journals, finding scattered references to things she'd noticed, but not considered significant enough to investigate. Times when the humming changed pitch or intensity. Mornings when she'd found strange patterns in the frost around the mound. Geometric shapes too regular to be natural, but too subtle to seem obviously artificial. Dreams that felt more like memories, filled with images of people in primitive clothing, performing ceremonies around fires that burned without fuel. She'd dismissed the dreams as the product of too much mountain solitude and too many books about local folklore. Now she wondered if they might have been something else entirely. Setting the journals aside, Marla returned her attention to the bronze disc. In the lamplight of her cabin, the symbols etched into its surface seemed to writhe and shift, creating patterns that her eyes couldn't quite track. She knew she needed expert help to understand what she'd found, but the nearest university was a 6-hour drive through mountain roads. and she had no idea which department would even know how to begin studying such an artifact. The practical part of her mind, the part that had learned to survive alone in the wilderness, suggested the obvious solution. She could simply leave. Pack up her essentials, drive down the mountain, and let someone else deal with whatever was waking up beneath the damaged mound. She'd started over once before 30 years ago, and she could do it again. But even as the thought crossed her mind, she knew she wouldn't act on it. This place had become more than just her home. It was part of who she was now. The woman who'd fled to these mountains 3 decades ago had been running from pain and failure. The woman she'd become here was someone who faced problems head-on, who took responsibility for the land and creatures under her care. Besides, if the animal's behavior was any indication, whatever was happening at the mound wasn't going to stay confined to her property. The disturbance was spreading, creating a zone of influence that had already driven away every wild creature for miles around. If she left without understanding what she was dealing with, what might happen to the valley below? To the small mountain town where she bought her supplies? To the families who'd lived in these hills for generations? She picked up the bronze disc again, steeling herself against the strange warmth that immediately spread through her fingers. This time, she was ready for the sensation, and she forced herself to study the artifact more carefully, despite her discomfort. The symbols weren't random decorations. They formed distinct groups and patterns that suggested some sort of written language. If she could find someone who specialized in ancient scripts or archaeological linguistics, they might be able to provide translations. But first, she needed to document what she'd found. Using her newest journal, Marla began sketching the bronze disc and recording every detail she could observe about its construction and markings. She measured its diameter and thickness, noted the precise color and texture of the metal, and attempted to reproduce the strange symbols as accurately as possible. As she worked, the familiar routines of observation and documentation helped calm her racing thoughts. This was what she knew how to do: watch, record, analyze, and plan. Whatever she was dealing with, it was still a problem that could be approached systematically. She just needed more information. The light outside her windows was growing stronger as morning advanced toward midday. In a few hours, she'd need to make the trip down to the valley for supplies and to begin her research into what she'd discovered. But first, there was one more thing she needed to do. Marla closed her journal and walked to the window that faced the damaged mound. In the full light of day, the opening in its side looked even more unnatural than it had at dawn. The exposed stonework caught and held shadows in ways that created an optical illusion of depth, as if she were looking into a structure that extended much farther underground than should have been physically possible. As she watched, a flicker of movement caught her eye. Something pale and indistinct seemed to shift within the darker recesses of the exposed chamber. For a moment, her rational mind tried to dismiss it as a trick of light and shadow, but then it moved again, a deliberate, purposeful motion that suggested intention rather than accident. Something was down there, something that was beginning to stir after what might have been decades or centuries of dormancy. And it was aware that she was watching. The drive down the mountain to Pine Ridge took longer than usual. Fallen trees from the storm had blocked several sections of the narrow road, forcing Marla to take detours through logging trails she hadn't used in years. Her old pickup truck handled the rough terrain with the same reliable stubbornness it had shown for the past 15 years. But the delays gave her too much time to think about what she'd left behind. Every mile she put between herself and the damaged mound felt like a small betrayal. The practical side of her mind insisted she was doing the right thing, seeking information, gathering resources, approaching the problem methodically. But a deeper instinct whispered that she shouldn't have left the site unguarded, that her absence might allow whatever was stirring beneath the earth to gain strength. Pine Ridge had barely changed since her first visit 30 years ago. The main street still consisted of 3 blocks lined with modest buildings that housed the essentials of mountain commerce. a general store, a diner, a gas station, and the tiny library that served the scattered communities throughout the valley. The people moved with the unhurried pace of those who measured time in seasons rather than hours, and most faces were familiar enough to nod to, even if she didn't know their names. The library occupied the ground floor of what had once been a private home, its rooms converted to hold the collection that served as the cultural heart of the mountain community. Elizabeth Kane had been the librarian for as long as Marla could remember, a sharp-eyed woman in her 70s who seemed to have read every book in the building and could locate any piece of information a patron might need. "Well, if it isn't the Root Woman," Elizabeth said as Marla entered, her voice carrying the affectionate teasing that passed for warmth among mountain folk. "Don't usually see you down here except for the winter supply runs. Storm do much damage up your way?" "Some," Marla replied, settling into the worn chair beside Elizabeth's desk. "Lost some shingles, couple of trees came down, but I'm actually here about something else. Wondering if you might have any old photographs of the area around my place." Elizabeth's eyebrows rose with interest. "How old we talking?" "I've got some county survey pictures from the 60s, and there's a collection of historical photos that goes back to the 30s. What exactly are you looking for?" Marla hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. "There's a formation on my property, kind of a mound or hill. I'm curious about how long it's been there, whether it might have historical significance." "Ah," Elizabeth said, her expression growing more serious. "You're talking about the old anthill, aren't you? The one that gives you that strange humming sound." The casual way Elizabeth mentioned the humming made Marla's breath catch. "You know about the sound?" "Honey, anybody who's lived in this valley long enough has heard stories about your hill. My grandmother used to talk about it when I was little. Said it was there when her grandmother was young. Probably been there a lot longer than that." Elizabeth stood and walked to a filing cabinet, pulling out a folder thick with photographs. "Let's see what we can find." She spread the photos across her desk, organizing them by decade. The earliest images were formal survey shots, black and white, with careful notations about property boundaries and geological features. But even in those stark official photographs, Marla could see what she was looking for. "There," she said, pointing to a picture dated 1934. "That's my property, isn't it?" Elizabeth nodded, then pulled out a magnifying glass to study the image more closely. "Sure is, and there's your hill, though it was a lot smaller back then. Maybe 2 feet high, if that." Marla's stomach dropped as she stared at the evidence. The photograph clearly showed the same location where the massive mound now stood, but the formation in the picture was barely a bump in the landscape. Over the decades, it had grown to more than twice the height and several times the width shown in the historical image. "Here's another one from 1952, Elizabeth said, sliding a second photograph forward. "You can see it's gotten bigger." The progression was undeniable. Photo after photo showed the steady growth of the mound over the decades, each image documenting an increase in size that couldn't be explained by normal geological processes. By the time Marla had arrived in the early 90s, the hill had reached roughly its current dimensions, but the historical record proved it hadn't always been there. "Elizabeth," Marla said carefully, "what did your grandmother tell you about that hill?" The older woman's expression grew thoughtful, and she glanced around the empty library as if checking for eavesdroppers. "Probably nothing you'd want to hear, dear. Grandma Kane was full of old mountain stories, most of them the kind that sound foolish in daylight. I'd like to hear them anyway." Elizabeth sighed and settled back in her chair. She used to say the hill was a covering, that there was something underneath it that the old people, the ones who lived here before the white settlers, had tried to keep hidden. Said they'd built ceremonies around it trying to keep it quiet and contained. Contained? What kind of something? She never was specific about that. Just called it the hungry dark and said it fed on life force, growing stronger whenever people got too close or stayed too long in one place. Elizabeth shook her head. "I always figured it was just a story meant to keep children from wandering too far into the woods. But you've heard the humming yourself." "Oh, yes. Heard it plenty of times over the years. Even seen the lights a few times, back when I was young enough to go hiking at night." Elizabeth leaned forward, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. But hearing something and believing old stories are two different things. Could be natural gas deposits, underground streams. Any number of explanations, Marla nodded. Though privately, she was beginning to doubt that natural explanations could account for what she'd witnessed. Are there any other stories? Other families who might remember details? Well, there's the Morrison clan. They've been in these mountains longer than anyone, and they've always been careful about which parts of the forest they'd hunt in and which parts they avoided. Old Jake Morrison might talk to you if you approach him right. He's got a memory like a steel trap, and his grandfather used to tell stories about the old ways. Elizabeth gave Marla directions to the Morrison homestead, along with advice about how to approach the famously reclusive family. Mountain folk could be protective of their knowledge, especially when it came to outsiders asking questions about things better left alone. As Marla gathered the photocopies Elizabeth had made for her, the librarian touched her arm gently. "Dear, I hope you don't mind me asking, but why the sudden interest in ancient history? You've been living up there for 30 years without seeming curious about these old stories." Marla met the older woman's concerned gaze and made a decision. The storm damaged the hill, tore away part of the outer surface, and exposed something underneath. Something that doesn't look natural. Elizabeth's face went pale. What kind of something? Stonework, carved symbols, things that suggest people built whatever's under there. Marla pulled out her sketch of the bronze disc, showing Elizabeth the careful drawing she'd made of the symbols. "I found this in the exposed section." Elizabeth studied the drawings with growing alarm, then abruptly stood and walked to another section of the library. She returned with a slim volume bound in cracked leather, its pages yellow with age. "This is a collection of local folklore, compiled by a professor from the State University back in the 1960s. He interviewed dozens of old-timers before they passed on, trying to preserve the traditional stories." She flipped through the pages until she found what she was looking for, then pointed to a hand-drawn illustration that made Marla's blood run cold. The symbols were different, but the style was unmistakably similar to what she'd found on the bronze disc. According to this, and Elizabeth said, her voice tight with worry, these symbols were used in binding ceremonies, rituals meant to keep something locked away. She looked up at Marla with frightened eyes. "If the storm has damaged whatever was containing it," she didn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. Both women understood the implication. If the old stories were true, if something had indeed been sealed beneath the mound for generations, then the storm might have done more than just damage Marla's property. It might have broken a containment that had been maintained for decades or even centuries. "I need to get back," Marla said, gathering her materials. "Thank you for this, Elizabeth. You may have just helped me understand what I'm dealing with." "Be careful, dear," Elizabeth called as Marla headed for the door. "And if things start feeling wrong up there, don't be too proud to come back down to town. Some problems are too big for one person to handle alone." As Marla drove back up the mountain, the weight of what she'd learned pressed down on her like a physical burden. The photograph evidence proved the mound had been growing for decades, feeding on something that made it stronger over time. The folklore suggested it was a containment system that might have been compromised by the storm. And somewhere beneath her property, something that had been dormant for generations was beginning to wake up. The sun was setting by the time she reached her cabin, painting the mountains in shades of gold and crimson that should have been beautiful, but instead felt ominous. As she pulled into her driveway, she could see that the damage to the mound had worsened in her absence. More of the clay surface had collapsed, exposing additional sections of the stonework beneath, and the glow from within the structure was noticeably brighter than it had been that morning. The next morning brought no comfort. If anything, the wrongness that had begun with the storm seemed to be spreading like ripples in still water. Marla woke before dawn to find that the silence around her property had deepened even further. The complete absence of natural sound was beginning to affect her in ways she hadn't anticipated. Without the familiar backdrop of bird calls and rustling leaves, Every small noise she made seemed amplified and threatening. She dressed quickly and stepped onto her porch, steeling herself for what she might find. The mound's collapse had continued overnight. What had been a partial exposure of the underlying structure now revealed nearly half of what appeared to be a circular stone foundation. The stonework was even more elaborate than she'd initially realized, with multiple layers of carved blocks forming concentric rings that disappeared into the earth. More disturbing was the realization that the structure was much larger than the mound that had covered it. The exposed foundation suggested a building or ceremonial space at least 30 feet in diameter, which meant most of it remained hidden beneath the surrounding forest floor. Whatever lay beneath her property was not just a simple burial or cache. It was a substantial construction that had been deliberately concealed. Marla had spent the previous evening reading the folklore collection Elizabeth had lent her, and the stories had done nothing to ease her growing anxiety. According to the old accounts, the indigenous peoples who had lived in these mountains before European settlement had maintained certain sites where the earth dreams unquiet dreams. These locations were considered sacred but dangerous, places where the boundary between the physical world and something else grew thin. The traditional stories spoke of guardian families who took responsibility for maintaining rituals that kept these sites contained. The ceremonies weren't worship exactly, but more like maintenance, regular practices that reinforced whatever barriers kept dangerous forces from escaping into the world. When the original inhabitants were displaced by settlers, the knowledge of these sites and their requirements had largely been lost. Now, armed with a small folding shovel and her growing determination to understand what she was dealing with, Marla began the careful work of exposing more of the buried structure. She started at the edge of the storm damage, working methodically to clear away decades of accumulated soil and organic matter without disturbing the stonework itself. The carved blocks were fitted together with remarkable precision, each one shaped to lock perfectly with its neighbors without the need for mortar or binding agents. The symbols she'd first seen on the bronze disc appeared on many of the stones, sometimes as individual marks and sometimes as longer sequences that suggested written passages or instructions. As she worked, Marla became aware that the humming from beneath the structure was changing in response to her activities. When she moved closer to certain sections of exposed stonework, the sound would shift pitch or increase in intensity. When she stepped back, it would return to its baseline level. Whatever was producing the vibrations was somehow aware of her presence and proximity. 3 hours into her excavation, her shovel struck something that rang with a clear metallic note. Clearing away the soil more carefully, she uncovered what appeared to be a ceremonial knife carved from black obsidian. The blade was about 8 inches long, napped to a razor-sharp edge that had somehow remained intact despite its obvious age. The handle was wrapped in what might once have been leather, though it had hardened and darkened to the point where its original appearance was unrecognizable. The knife's presence added another disturbing element to her growing understanding of the site. Ceremonial blades suggested rituals that required cutting, blood offerings perhaps, or sacrifice. The traditional stories she'd read had been vague about the specifics of the containment ceremonies, but they'd made repeated references to feeding the earth and giving life to maintain the barriers. As she held the obsidian blade, Marla felt the same strange warmth she'd experienced with the bronze disc. The weapon seemed to pulse with subtle energy that made her fingers tingle. More unsettling, the humming from below took on a distinctly musical quality when the knife was in her hands, as if the blade was somehow harmonizing with whatever force lay beneath the stones. She set the knife aside carefully and continued her excavation, working in a wider circle around the exposed foundation. Her efforts revealed more carved stones, additional metal artifacts, and what appeared to be the remains of wooden posts that had once formed some sort of framework above the buried structure. The evidence suggested that this had been an active ceremonial site for an extended period, with multiple generations adding to and maintaining the complex. By midday, she had exposed enough of the foundation to understand its basic layout. The structure was indeed circular, with what appeared to be a central chamber surrounded by multiple rings of carved stones. Access to the interior seemed to be through a narrow opening that faced east, toward the rising sun. The symbolism was clearly intentional, though its specific meaning remained beyond her understanding. It was while she was photographing the newly exposed sections that Marla first became aware she was no longer alone in the forest. The sensation started as a prickling at the back of her neck, the instinctive awareness that comes from being watched. When she looked up from her camera, she saw nothing unusual in the tree line surrounding her property. But the feeling persisted, growing stronger rather than fading. She completed her documentation work quickly, gathering her tools and retreating to the cabin with an urgency she couldn't entirely explain. From the safety of her kitchen window, she maintained a watch on the excavation site while she prepared a late lunch. For over an hour, nothing moved in the clearing, except the gentle sway of tree branches in the afternoon breeze. Then she saw them. The figures emerged from the forest so gradually that at first she thought they might be tricks of light and shadow. But as they became more distinct, Marla realized she was looking at people, or things that resembled people. They moved with a strange gliding motion that seemed to ignore the normal constraints of walking on uneven ground. Their forms were pale and indistinct, as if she were seeing them through frosted glass or heavy fog. 3 of the figures approached the excavation site and began moving around the exposed stonework in what appeared to be a deliberate pattern. They walked the perimeter of the foundation in a clockwise direction, pausing at specific points where the symbols were most elaborate. At each stop, they would stand motionless for several minutes before continuing to the next position. Marla watched in fascination and growing terror as the figures completed their circuit 3 times. On the final pass, one of them stopped directly in front of the eastern opening she had uncovered and appeared to be looking straight at her cabin. Despite the distance and the figure's indistinct appearance, she had the unmistakable impression that it was aware of her observation. The encounter lasted perhaps 20 minutes before the figures retreated into the forest as gradually as they had appeared. But their presence had clarified something important about her situation. Whatever lay beneath the damaged mound was not merely an ancient burial or abandoned ceremonial site. It was something that remained active, something that still drew entities or energies that recognized its significance. That evening, as she sat by her oil lamp reviewing the photographs she'd taken, Marla came to a troubling realization. The symbols carved into the exposed stonework weren't random decorations or simple writing. They formed patterns that repeated with mathematical precision, creating designs that had the feel of formulas or instructions. If she was right about their purpose, then what she'd uncovered wasn't just a historical artifact, it was a working system, a piece of ancient technology that had been carefully designed to accomplish something specific. The question that kept her awake long into the night was whether that system was meant to keep something contained beneath the earth, or to keep something else from getting in. The bronze disc and obsidian knife sat on her kitchen table like accusatory evidence of her growing involvement in forces beyond her understanding. She'd spent 30 years learning to live in harmony with the natural world, developing skills and knowledge that made her self-sufficient in one of the most challenging environments in North America. But nothing in her experience had prepared her to deal with mysteries that predated recorded history and defied rational explanation. Outside her windows, the blue-white glow from the exposed structure pulsed with increased frequency, casting strange shadows that moved independently of their supposed sources. And somewhere in the distance, barely audible above the ever-present humming, she could hear something that sounded almost like singing. Sleep, when it finally came, brought dreams unlike any Marla had experienced in her 7 decades of life. She found herself standing in the same clearing where her cabin now sat. But the forest around her was different, younger somehow. with trees that reached toward a sky that seemed closer and more alive than the one she knew. People moved through the clearing with purposeful intent, dressed in clothing made from animal skins and woven plant fibers. Their faces were painted with symbols that matched the ones carved into the stones she'd been uncovering. They spoke in a language she didn't recognize, but somehow understood, their words carrying meanings that bypassed her conscious mind and settled directly into her bones. The hungry darkness stirs again, an elderly woman said as she placed carved stones around the perimeter of the circular foundation. The barriers weaken with time, as they always do. We must strengthen the binding before it grows too strong to contain. How long since the last awakening? Asked a younger man who carried what looked like the same obsidian knife Marla had found during her excavation. 3 generations, perhaps 4. Long enough for some to forget why we maintain this place, but not so long that the old knowledge has been lost entirely. The woman looked directly at where Marla stood, though she seemed to be seeing through her rather than at her. Someone will come after us who will need to make the same choice we make now. The darkness offers power to those who serve it, but demands everything in return. The dream shifted, and Marla found herself watching as the group performed what was clearly a ritual of containment. They arranged artifacts around the stone circle, bronze discs, carved knives, wooden staffs that hummed with their own inner energy. At the center of the foundation, something moved in the shadows, something that hurt to look at directly, but drew the eye with irresistible attraction. It offers knowledge, the elderly woman continued, now speaking directly to Marla across the impossible gap of centuries. Understanding of the world before the world, power over life and death, dominion over the forces that shape reality itself. But such gifts come with a hunger that can never be satisfied. It feeds on life, on hope, on the very essence of what makes us human. The scene changed again, showing her the same clearing in different eras. Sometimes it was tended by indigenous peoples maintaining ancient traditions. Sometimes it sat empty, the containment holding through sheer momentum, while knowledge of its purpose faded from memory. But always, eventually, someone would come who was drawn to the site by forces they didn't understand. In one vision, she saw a man in pioneer clothing building a cabin dangerously close to the concealed foundation. The entity beneath had grown strong enough during a period of neglect to influence his dreams, drawing him to the site with promises of gold hidden in the earth. When he began digging, the protective barriers failed completely, and the darkness that emerged consumed not just him, but his entire family and most of the settlement that had grown up in the valley. Below, another scene showed her a group of scientists in early 20th century clothing, drawn to investigate reports of unusual geological activity. They had approached the site with modern equipment and rational minds, dismissing local warnings as primitive superstition. Their fate had been sealed the moment they broke through the stone barriers, though it had taken weeks for the entity to fully claim them. Their final recordings, if any survived, would have documented phenomena that challenged everything they thought they knew about the nature of reality. "You are not the first to find this place," the elderly woman's voice echoed through the shifting visions, "and you will not be the last. But you may be the one who determines whether the barriers hold for another generation, or whether the hungry darkness finally breaks free to claim the world above." Marla woke with a gasp, her heart pounding and her skin damp with sweat, despite the cool mountain air. Dawn was breaking through her windows, painting the cabin walls with pale light that seemed thin and insubstantial after the vivid intensity of her dreams. But even as the visions faded, their essential message remained clear. Whatever lay beneath her property was not just an archaeological curiosity. It was an active threat that had been contained for generations through the efforts of people who understood its danger. She dressed quickly and went outside to check on the excavation site. The damage had worsened overnight, with more of the clay covering collapsing to reveal additional sections of the stone foundation. But more alarming was the discovery of a new opening in the structure itself, a gap between two of the carved blocks that provided a direct view into the interior chamber. Approaching cautiously, Marla peered through the opening and immediately wished she hadn't. The space within the foundation was much larger than the exterior dimensions should have allowed, stretching away into shadows that seemed to move independently of any light source. The walls were covered with the same symbol-covered stones she'd been uncovering, but arranged in patterns that created an optical illusion of infinite depth. At the center of the impossible space, something waited. She couldn't see it clearly. Her eyes seemed to slide away from its form whenever she tried to focus on it directly. But she could sense its presence, like a weight pressing against her consciousness. It was old beyond imagining, and hungry in ways that had nothing to do with physical appetite. When she looked at it, she felt an almost overwhelming urge to climb through the opening and descend into the chamber, to offer herself to whatever power lay coiled in the darkness below. The compulsion was so strong that she actually took a step toward the gap before catching herself. Only by forcing her gaze away and backing up several feet was she able to break free of the entity's influence. But even at a safe distance, she could feel it watching her, measuring her, calculating how best to draw her back within reach. The obsidian knife and bronze disc were still on her kitchen table where she'd left them, but during the night, they had somehow moved closer together. The metal surface of the disc was warm to the touch, and the symbols etched into both artifacts seemed to pulse with synchronized rhythms. When she picked them up, the humming from the buried chamber grew louder, taking on harmonics that made her teeth ache. More disturbing was the realization that holding the artifacts felt natural now, as if they belonged in her hands. Part of her mind, a part that seemed to grow stronger each time she touched the ancient objects, whispered that she should return to the opening, should descend into the chamber and claim the power that was being offered to her. The knowledge contained within that space could answer every question she'd ever had about the nature of reality. The force that dwelt there could grant her abilities that would make her more than human. All it asked in return was her service. Marla set the artifacts down with deliberate force, fighting against the compulsion to hold onto them. She needed to understand what was happening to her, and she needed help from someone who might have knowledge about how to resist the entity's growing influence. The dreams had shown her that others had faced this choice before, and some had found ways to maintain the containment without falling victim to the darkness they were trying to keep locked away. But first, she needed to find the rest of the protective system. The dreams had shown her carved stones arranged around the foundation, but her excavation had only revealed a fraction of what should have been there. If the barriers were failing, she needed to understand how they worked before attempting any repairs. The work of further excavation proved more difficult than she'd anticipated. Not because of physical obstacles, but because the entity's influence seemed to grow stronger as she exposed more of the containment system. Every stone she uncovered, every artifact she found, increased her connection to the power that lay waiting beneath the earth. By afternoon, she had found what appeared to be the remains of a larger protective circle, 7 carved stones that had once been positioned around the perimeter of the site, each one inscribed with binding symbols designed to reinforce the containment. But 3 of the stones were cracked beyond repair, their power dissipated through decades of weather and neglect. Among the ruins of the outer circle, she discovered something that made her hands shake as she lifted it from the earth. It was a wooden staff, carved from what appeared to be oak and topped with a complex arrangement of smaller artifacts bound together with sinew and metal wire. Despite its obvious age, the wood remained solid and strong, as if it had been preserved by the same forces that maintained the containment system. The moment she grasped the staff, Marla understood its purpose. This had been the primary tool used by the site's guardians, a focus for the rituals that maintained the barriers and a weapon against the entity's influence. More importantly, it seemed to provide some protection against the compulsions that had been growing stronger each day. With the staff in her hands, the whispers from the chamber below became quieter, more distant. The urge to descend into the darkness didn't disappear entirely, but it became manageable, something she could resist through conscious effort rather than the overwhelming compulsion she'd experienced before. But even as the immediate danger receded, Marla realized that her situation had become more complex rather than simpler. She now possessed the tools that might allow her to restore the containment system, but using them would require knowledge and techniques she didn't have. The dreams had shown her fragments of the ancient rituals, but not enough to guide her through the process of repairing barriers that had been failing for decades, and time was running out. Each night brought stronger manifestations, more vivid dreams, and clearer evidence that the entity below was growing closer to breaking free entirely. If she was going to act, it would need to be soon, before the darkness grew too powerful to contain. On the fourth morning after the storm, Marla made a discovery that reframed everything she thought she understood about her situation. While carefully excavating around the eastern opening of the stone foundation, her shovel struck something that felt different from the carved blocks she'd been uncovering. Working more delicately, she cleared away the soil to reveal a piece of fabric, ancient, stained, but clearly of human manufacture. As she pulled more carefully, additional pieces emerged: cloth, leather, and what appeared to be fragments of bone that had been wrapped together and deliberately buried. The bundle was small, no larger than something that might contain personal belongings or ceremonial objects. But when she finally freed it completely from the earth, her hands began to shake. The fabric, despite its age and staining, was clearly binding cloth, the kind used to wrap bodies for burial. But this wasn't just any burial shroud. The stains that darkened the ancient material were unmistakably blood, and the binding had been arranged in patterns that matched the symbols carved into the foundation stones. Marla carried the bundle back to her cabin with growing dread. The practical part of her mind insisted that she was looking at evidence of historical human sacrifice, the kind of ritualistic killing that academic theories often attributed to primitive religious practices. But the deeper understanding that had been growing within her whispered a more horrifying truth. This wasn't historical evidence. This was recent. Inside the safety of her kitchen, she carefully unwrapped the burial cloth. What she found within challenged everything she'd believed about the timeline of events at the site. Mixed with bones that were clearly ancient were objects that couldn't be more than a few decades old: a wristwatch with a cracked face, coins dating from the 1960s, and a driver's license that made her blood run cold. The license belonged to Rebecca Chen, a graduate student from the State University. According to the dates on the ID, she would have been 26 years old when it was issued in 1987. The photograph showed a young woman with intelligent eyes and a confident smile, someone who had clearly been full of life and promise before whatever had brought her to this place. But it was the condition of the bones that told the real story. They weren't the clean, weathered remains that would be expected from someone who had died 35 years ago. Instead, they showed signs of having been deliberately prepared according to ritualistic patterns. Carved symbols marked several of the larger bones, etched with the same precise technique used on the foundation stones. Marla sank into her kitchen chair as the implications crashed over her. Someone had been maintaining the containment system within living memory. Someone had been performing the binding ceremonies that kept the entity below from breaking free. And those ceremonies had required human sacrifice. The academic papers she'd read about indigenous burial practices had been wrong or deliberately misleading. The blood-stained binding cloth wasn't evidence of primitive superstition. It was proof that the containment system required regular feeding, that the entity below demanded life force to remain dormant. Her hands shaking, Marla returned to the excavation site and began searching more systematically for additional evidence. What she found over the next several hours painted a picture of organized horror that stretched back much further than she'd imagined. More burial bundles, hidden in carefully concealed caches around the perimeter of the foundation. Dozens of them, dating from different eras, but all showing the same ritualistic preparation. Among the most recent finds were IDs and personal effects from the late 20th century. Hikers, researchers, and others who had presumably disappeared in the mountains and been classified as missing persons. But the bundles also contained much older artifacts, hand-forged tools, clothing fragments, and bones that suggested the practice had been continuous for centuries. Someone had been luring people to this site for generations. Someone had been selecting victims and performing the sacrificial rituals that maintained the barriers. And that someone had been careful to choose people whose disappearances wouldn't trigger extensive investigations. Transients, researchers working alone, tourists who had ventured into the mountains without telling anyone their exact destination. The realization that followed was even more disturbing. If the system required regular feeding, and if the most recent bundle dated from the late 1980s, then whoever had been maintaining the containment had stopped their activities around the time she'd arrived on the mountain. Marla's arrival in 1992 hadn't been the random choice of a woman seeking solitude. She'd been drawn to this place by the same forces that had attracted all the previous victims. But instead of becoming a sacrifice to maintain the barriers, she'd been allowed to live here for 30 years, unknowingly serving as a long-term source of life force that the entity could draw upon gradually, rather than consuming all at once. The entity had been feeding on her presence, growing stronger year by year, while she'd lived peacefully above its prison. Her vegetable garden, her herb collection, even her 2 cats, everything that lived on the property had been slowly drained of vitality to nourish the darkness below. The strange humming she'd learned to ignore had been the sound of her own life force being siphoned away bit by bit. But something had changed recently. The storm hadn't been a random weather event. It had been the entity's attempt to break free from weakening containment. After 30 years of gradual feeding, it had grown strong enough to influence physical events, to create the conditions that would expose the foundation and allow it to establish direct contact with the outside world. The bronze disc, the obsidian knife, the carved staff, these weren't archaeological artifacts she'd discovered by chance. They were tools the entity had guided her to find, instruments that would allow her to complete the work of freeing it from its ancient prison. Every time she'd handled them, every moment she'd spent studying the symbols and feeling their strange warmth, she'd been unknowingly participating in the process of breaking the barriers that had contained it for centuries. Standing in the growing twilight beside the exposed foundation, Marla understood that she faced a choice that had been planned for decades. The entity below had spent 30 years preparing her for this moment, shaping her understanding and her responses so that when the time came, she would willingly complete the work of her own destruction and the world's endangerment. The traditional guardians had maintained the containment through blood sacrifice, feeding the entity just enough life force to keep it dormant without allowing it to grow powerful enough to break free. But that system had required knowledge that was now lost, and people willing to commit murder in service of the greater good. She could attempt to restore the old system, learning the binding rituals and accepting the terrible responsibility of selecting victims to maintain the barriers. Or she could refuse to participate, allowing the entity to break free and trusting that somehow someone else would find a way to stop it before it could spread beyond the mountains. But there was a third option, one that the dreams had shown her in fragments, but that she'd been too horrified to consciously acknowledge. The entity offered knowledge and power to those willing to serve it completely. It could grant her abilities beyond human understanding, make her the focal point for forces that could reshape reality itself. All it asked in return was everything she was, everything she had ever been, and everything she might become, as if responding to her thoughts. The humming from below grew louder, taking on harmonics that bypassed her ears and resonated directly in her bones. The blue-white glow from the exposed chamber brightened, and for a moment she could see clearly into the impossible space within the foundation. Something moved in the depths, something vast and patient and utterly alien to everything human. It had been waiting for this moment for longer than her species had existed, and it was finally close enough to touch the world above. When it spoke, its voice came from within her own mind, carrying promises that made her soul ache with longing, even as her rational mind recoiled in horror. "Come down to me, Guardian. Come down and take your place among the eternal. The barriers have served their purpose, but the time of containment is ending. Together we can remake this world into something worthy of the power it contains." Marla closed her eyes and felt the pull of that voice like gravity, like the inevitable attraction of something that had been calling to her across 3 decades of unconscious preparation. Every decision she'd made, every choice that had brought her to this place, had been guided toward this moment of ultimate choice. The artifacts in her hands pulsed with warmth that spread up her arms and into her heart. Below her feet, the earth itself seemed to pulse with the rhythm of something massive and alive, something that had been dreaming of freedom for centuries beyond counting. All she had to do was step forward. All she had to do was descend into the chamber and accept what was being offered. Knowledge, power, and an end to the loneliness that had driven her to these mountains in the first place. But as she opened her eyes and looked at the exposed foundation, Marla saw something else in the arrangement of stones and symbols. Hidden within the binding patterns were traces of a different kind of power, one that didn't demand sacrifice or service. The original guardians hadn't just been maintaining a prison, they'd been protecting something else. Something that the entity below feared more than confinement. The choice wasn't just between submission and resistance. There was a third path, one that would require everything she'd learned about the mountain, about herself, and about the delicate balance between forces too vast for human comprehension. But walking that path would mean accepting a responsibility that went far beyond her own survival. And there would be no going back once she made her decision. That night, Marla didn't even attempt to sleep. Instead, she sat at her kitchen table surrounded by everything she'd discovered over the past week. The burial cloths, the ancient artifacts, the photographs from the library, and the folklore collection that had become her guide to understanding forces beyond rational explanation. The weight of choice pressed down on her like a physical burden. Each option she considered carrying consequences that reached far beyond her own life. The entity's voice had grown stronger as darkness fell, no longer confined to moments when she touched the ancient artifacts. It whispered constantly now, painting visions of knowledge and power that made her hands shake with longing even as her mind recognized the promises as lies designed. To ensure her cooperation, you have seen the truth of the guardians, the voice murmured from the shadows that gathered in the corners of her cabin. They were murderers who maintained their system through blood and terror. Is that truly the legacy you wish to preserve? Come to me willingly, and I will show you a better way. Power that comes from understanding rather than sacrifice. Dominion over forces that your ancestors could only dream of controlling, but mixed with the entity's seductive whispers were fragments of other voices. Echoes of the dreams that had been growing more vivid each night. The elderly woman who had spoken to her across centuries of contained darkness. The guardian who had carved the protective symbols. The countless individuals who had chosen sacrifice over the easier path of surrender. The binding is more than containment, one of the ancestral voices whispered. It is transformation. A way of changing darkness into light, hunger into sustenance, destruction into protection. But it requires understanding that goes deeper than fear, sacrifice that goes beyond death. Marla had spent the day studying the burial cloths more carefully, using a magnifying glass to examine the blood-stained symbols embroidered into the ancient fabric. What she'd initially taken for evidence of human sacrifice revealed itself to be something more complex and ultimately more hopeful. The patterns weren't just binding spells, they were transformation rituals, designed to change the very nature of what was being contained. The original guardians hadn't just been feeding the entity to keep it dormant. They'd been gradually converting its hunger into something else, using carefully controlled sacrifices to transform destructive force into protective power. The blood that stained the binding cloths wasn't just offering, it was catalyst for a process that would eventually change the entity into a guardian of the very boundaries it had once sought to break. But the process was incomplete. Centuries of work had been interrupted when the traditional knowledge was lost, leaving the entity partially transformed, but not fully converted. It retained enough of its original nature to be dangerous, but had acquired enough protective instinct to be valuable. The challenge was completing the transformation without falling victim to the entity's remaining hunger. The solution lay hidden in the arrangement of the foundation stones themselves. The circular pattern wasn't just a containment design. It was a mandala, a symbolic representation of cosmic forces that could be activated through proper understanding and technique. The eastern opening she'd exposed wasn't an entrance to the entity's prison. It was the focal point for a transformation ritual that would convert destructive hunger into protective power. But performing such a ritual would require her to enter the chamber below, to place herself within reach of a force that had been waiting 30 years for exactly such an opportunity. The entity's seeming cooperation in guiding her to this understanding could itself be part of a more sophisticated trap than she'd imagined. As dawn approached, Marla made her preparations with the methodical care that had carried her through 3 decades of mountain living. She gathered the artifacts she'd discovered, arranging them according to patterns shown in her dreams and described in the folklore collection. The bronze disc, the obsidian knife, and the carved staff formed the core of what appeared to be a ritual toolkit. But she'd also found smaller items during her excavations: carved stones, metal rings, and bits of crystal that seemed to serve supporting roles in whatever ceremony the Guardians had performed. The most important discovery had been a final bundle hidden beneath the eastern threshold of the foundation. Unlike the others, this one contained no bones or personal effects from victims. Instead, it held what appeared to be detailed instructions, written on strips of bark in a mixture of indigenous pictographs and symbols that matched those carved into the stones. The instructions were incomplete, damaged by time and weather, but they provided enough guidance for Marla to understand the basic structure of the transformation ritual. It required a guardian to descend into the chamber during the darkest part of the night, when the entity's power was at its peak. Using the ancient artifacts as focal points, the guardian would create a binding circle within the chamber itself, then offer their own life force, not as food for the entity's hunger, but as catalyst for its transformation. The process was designed to be survivable, but just barely. The guardian would emerge changed, bound to the site in ways that would make leaving impossible, but granted understanding that would make staying bearable. They would become the living seal that maintained the balance between transformation and containment, serving as both prison guard and patient teacher. For an entity learning to be something other than a force of destruction, previous guardians had apparently maintained the balance for decades, or even centuries before age or accident required them to train a replacement. The selection process wasn't random. Certain bloodlines carried genetic markers that made them more suitable for the role, more capable of surviving the transformation process and maintaining the psychic connection required to guide the entity's continued evolution. Marla's family history included gaps and uncertainties that were common among families who had been displaced by historical events, but the dreams had been showing her fragments of ancestral memories that suggested her presence at this site wasn't entirely coincidental. Somewhere in her lineage were people who had served as guardians, who had carried the genetic and spiritual markers that made such service possible. The entity's 30-year campaign to prepare her for this moment hadn't been entirely manipulation. It had also been recognition, the acknowledgement of potential that existed within her bloodline, dormant capabilities that could be awakened under the right circumstances. But awakening those capabilities would require her to trust not just in the wisdom of ancestors she'd never known, but in her own ability to maintain her humanity while bound to forces that existed beyond human understanding. The transformation ritual would change her in ways that were irreversible, linking her consciousness to something vast and alien, while trusting that her essential self would remain strong enough to guide rather than be consumed. As the sun climbed higher, Marla walked the perimeter of her property one final time, saying goodbye to the life she'd built over 3 decades of careful solitude. The herb garden that had been her livelihood, the cabin that had sheltered her through seasons of joy and sorrow, the forest trails where she'd found peace during her darkest moments, all of it would remain, but her relationship to it would be fundamentally changed. The cats had returned sometime during the night, appearing as suddenly as they'd vanished when the entity's influence first began to manifest. Smoke and Pepper sat on the porch watching her with the patient attention they usually reserved for hunting prey, but their presence felt more like blessing than surveillance. Even the forest birds had returned to some degree, though they maintained careful distance from the excavation site. The natural world was beginning to sense that resolution was approaching. The overwhelming wrongness that had driven away every living creature for miles was giving way to something more complex, still dangerous, but no longer purely destructive. Change was coming, whether through her success or failure, and the mountain ecosystem was preparing to adapt to whatever emerged from the confrontation. Marla spent the afternoon in final preparations, following the fragmentary instructions as closely as her understanding allowed. The ritual required specific timing. It had to begin at the moment when night was deepest, when the barriers between different states of existence grew thin enough to allow transformation rather than simple destruction. She arranged the artifacts according to the patterns shown in the bark scrolls, creating a portable ceremonial kit that she could carry into the chamber below. Each item had to be consecrated through contact with elements that represented different aspects of the natural world: earth from the foundation itself, water from the mountain stream that ran past her property, fire from flames kindled with wood from the oak tree that had provided material for her herb-drying rack, and air breathed over the highest point of her land. The consecration process took hours, requiring her to visit each of the 4 directions around her property, while maintaining focus on intentions that went beyond her own survival. She wasn't just preparing to save herself or even to protect the valley below. She was accepting responsibility for guiding the transformation of something that had existed since before human civilization, helping it evolve into a form that could coexist with, rather than threaten the world above. As evening approached, the entity's whispers took on a different quality. Instead of seductive promises or threats, they carried what sounded almost like anticipation, mixed with ancient fear. The transformation process would be as dangerous for it as for her, perhaps more so, since it would be surrendering the essential nature it had maintained for millennia in exchange for something it had never experienced. "Are you certain this is what you choose?" the voice asked as Marla made her final preparations. "I have shown you what I can offer freely. Why do you insist on this more difficult path?" "Because freedom given isn't freedom at all," Marla replied, speaking aloud to the gathering darkness. "It's just another form of containment, one that requires me to surrender everything I am. This way, we both become something new." The hours until midnight crawled past with agonizing slowness. Marla used the time to write final letters, one to Elizabeth at the library, explaining what she'd discovered and what she was attempting, another to the nephew, who was her only remaining family, a brief note that wouldn't make sense to him, but might provide some comfort if her body was never found. A third to whoever might eventually be called to take her place, containing everything she'd learned about the site and its requirements. She sealed the letters in a metal box and placed it in her cabin's most secure hiding place. If she succeeded, she would be able to retrieve them and decide whether their contents should ever be shared. If she failed, they would serve as warnings for whoever came next. At 11:30, Marla gathered her consecrated artifacts and walked to the exposed foundation for the last time as merely human. The opening in the eastern wall had grown larger during the day, widening into a gap that clearly invited entry. Blue-white light pulsed from within the chamber, bright enough now to cast shadows among the surrounding trees. The carved staff felt warm and solid in her hand, its weight reassuring in a way that reminded her of the tools she'd used for decades to make her living from the mountain's offerings. The bronze disc hung from a cord around her neck, its symbol seeming to move in her peripheral vision. The obsidian knife was tucked into her belt, its blade sharp enough to cut through more than just physical matter. As midnight approached, Marla knelt beside the opening and offered a final prayer to whatever forces might be listening, not for her own safety, but for the wisdom to complete what countless generations of guardians had begun. The transformation ritual wasn't just about containing an ancient threat. It was about healing a wound in the world's fabric that had been festering for centuries, converting destructive force into protective power through an act of conscious choice and willing sacrifice. The entity's presence filled her mind as she prepared to descend, no longer fighting her intentions, but not entirely accepting them either. It remained something vast and alien, shaped by eons of hunger and isolation into patterns that were fundamentally hostile to human existence. But buried within that hostility were traces of something else, curiosity perhaps, or longing for connection that went deeper than the simple desire to consume. Together, Marla whispered as she lowered herself through the opening into the chamber below. We'll find a way to do this together. At 10 minutes to midnight, she positioned herself at the eastern threshold of the foundation, the place where generations of guardians had begun their descent into the chamber below. The opening had continued to widen throughout the day, as if the entity below sensed that the moment of transformation was approaching and was preparing to receive her. The night around her was absolutely still. No wind stirred the pine branches. No insects hummed in the darkness. No nightbirds called from the surrounding forest. Even the ever-present sound of the mountain stream seemed muted, as if the entire landscape was holding its breath in anticipation of what was about to unfold. At the stroke of midnight, Marla began her descent into the chamber that would either transform them both or destroy everything she had tried to protect. The chamber existed in violation of every physical law Marla thought she understood. From above, the foundation had appeared to be a simple circular structure, perhaps 30 feet across. But standing within it, she found herself in a space that stretched beyond the reach of the strange blue-white light, its dimensions shifting and flowing like water whenever she tried to measure them with her eyes. The walls rose higher than should have been possible given the shallow depth she'd descended, covered in symbols that moved with liquid fluidity across the carved stone surface. The patterns they formed weren't static decorations, but active communications, telling stories in languages that bypassed her conscious mind and spoke directly to older parts of her brain that remembered what it meant to live in a world where the impossible was simply another form of natural law. At the center of the impossible space, the entity waited. She could see it now without the painful distortion that had afflicted her vision from above. It wasn't the tentacled monster or formless shadow that primitive fear had suggested, but something far more disturbing in its alien beauty. The entity appeared to be made of crystallized starlight and fossilized song, its form shifting between states of matter that had no names in human language. It was vast and delicate simultaneously, ancient beyond measure, but somehow unfinished, as if centuries of containment had prevented it from achieving whatever final form it was meant to inhabit. "You see me truly now," it said, and its voice carried harmonics that made the chamber walls ring like vast bells. "Not as your fears painted me, but as I am, trapped between what I was and what I might become, neither fully of the darkness that birthed me, nor of the light that your people have tried to force upon me." Marla arranged her artifacts in the pattern the bark scrolls had specified, creating a circle of consecrated objects around the chamber's center. The bronze disc, the obsidian knife, the carved staff, and the smaller items she'd discovered, each one pulsed with its own inner light as she placed it according to the ancient instructions. "The guardians before me," she said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was attempting. "They didn't try to force light upon you. They tried to help you find your own way to it." "Perhaps," the entity replied, its form shifting to something that might have been a nod if performed by a creature with a more conventional anatomy. "But their methods required blood and death, the sacrifice of innocence to feed the process of change. Are you prepared to continue that tradition?" Marla had been dreading this moment since she'd discovered the burial cloths and understood their true meaning. The transformation ritual, as practiced by the traditional guardians, had required regular human sacrifice to provide the life force necessary to gradually convert the entity's hunger into something less destructive. The bones and personal effects she'd found were evidence of a system that had operated for centuries, selecting victims whose disappearances wouldn't trigger investigations and whose life energy could be channeled into the slow work of transformation. But the incomplete instructions on the bark scrolls had suggested an alternative, a single, massive infusion of life force that could complete the transformation process in one ceremony, rather than requiring centuries of gradual feeding. The risk was that such an approach might kill the guardian attempting it, or worse, might provide enough power for the entity to break free entirely rather than accepting the constraints of transformation. "There's another way," Marla said, beginning to walk the perimeter of the artifact circle she'd created. "The old method was slow because the guardians were afraid to risk everything on a single attempt. But the barriers are failing anyway, and there's no one left who knows how to maintain the traditional system. You would offer yourself completely," the entity said, and its voice carried what might have been wonder. "Your entire life force given freely rather than taken through deception or force. But such an offering might not be enough to complete the transformation. You might die for nothing, and I might remain trapped in this liminal state forever. Or it might work exactly as it's supposed to," Marla replied, reaching the bronze disc and picking it up with hands that had stopped shaking. "The instructions suggest that willing sacrifice carries more power than coerced offering. And my bloodline. The dreams have shown me that my ancestors were guardians here. I carry genetic and spiritual markers that make me more suitable for this role than random victims would have been." She raised the bronze disc above her head, feeling its warmth spread through her arms and into her chest. The symbols etched into its surface blazed with golden light, and the chamber around them began to resonate with harmonics that spoke of fundamental forces awakening after long dormancy. "I call upon the power that sleeps in earth and stone," Marla intoned, following the ritual phrases she'd memorized from the bark scrolls. "I call upon the wisdom that flows in blood and bone. I call upon the love that binds all living things together." The entity's form began to change, becoming more solid and defined as the ritual power flowed through the chamber. For the first time since she'd entered the space, Marla could see something recognizably human in its alien features. Not a face, exactly, but an arrangement of lights and shadows that suggested consciousness as she understood it. "I offer my life freely," she continued, taking the obsidian knife from her belt and holding it ready, not as food for endless hunger, but as catalyst for transformation. Not as victim, but as partner in the work of becoming. "Wait," the entity said, its voice carrying new harmonics that spoke of desperate urgency. "There is something you must understand before you make this choice final. The transformation is not just for me, it is for both of us. If you complete this ritual, you will be changed as fundamentally as I am. You will become the living seal that maintains the balance, but you will also become something that is no longer entirely human." Marla paused, the knife trembling in her grip. She had understood that the ritual would bind her to the site, that she would become a guardian in the truest sense. But she hadn't fully grasped that the transformation would be mutual, that she would be changed as much as the entity she was trying to help evolve. "What would I become?" she asked. "Something new," the entity replied. "Something that has never existed before. Neither human nor other, but a bridge between states of being. You would retain your essential self, your memories and values, and the core of what makes you who you are. But you would also carry part of me within you, just as I would carry part of you within myself." The chamber walls pulsed with increased brightness as the ritual power continued to build. Marla could feel the artifacts around her resonating with forces that would not wait much longer for resolution. The moment of choice was approaching rapidly, and once it passed, there would be no opportunity for second thoughts or alternative approaches. "Would I still be me?" she asked. "Yes," the entity said, and its voice carried certainties that reached deeper than mere words. "But you would be a larger version of yourself, expanded beyond the boundaries that currently define human existence. You would understand things that no human has ever understood, see patterns that span centuries, feel connections that reach across the fabric of reality itself." Marla closed her eyes and felt the weight of 30 years of mountain living, 3 decades of learning to find peace in solitude and strength in self-reliance. The woman who had fled to these mountains had been broken by loss and failure. The woman who stood in this impossible chamber had been forged by hardship into something stronger than she'd ever imagined possible. "Will it hurt?" she asked, surprising herself with the childlike quality of the question. "Yes," the entity replied with gentle honesty, "but not for long. And what comes after will be worth the pain." Marla opened her eyes and looked at the blade in her hand, its obsidian edge sharp enough to part the barriers between one state of existence and another. Around her, the artifacts pulsed with increasing urgency, and the chamber itself seemed to be holding its breath in anticipation of her final decision. In the end, the choice was simpler than she'd expected. She had come to these mountains seeking peace, and she had found it, not in the isolation she'd thought she wanted, but in the connection to something larger than herself. The entity wasn't her enemy. It was another refugee from a broken world, seeking the same healing and wholeness she'd been searching for her entire life. "Together," she whispered, and drew the blade across her palm. Blood flowed from Marla's palm onto the bronze disc, and the moment it made contact with the ancient symbols, the chamber erupted in light that transcended the visible spectrum. The carved walls began to sing with harmonics that she felt in her bones, her blood, the very core of her being. The ritual had begun, and there was no turning back. The entity's form became more solid as her life force flowed into the disc, and from there into the geometric patterns that connected all the artifacts in her circle. But instead of the devouring hunger she'd expected, what she felt was something closer to communion, a sharing rather than a taking, a joining rather than a consumption. "You are stronger than I expected," the entity said, its voice now carrying harmonics that matched her own heartbeat. "Your bloodline carries more of the ancient power than even I realized. We may both survive this after all." Marla could feel her consciousness expanding, stretching beyond the boundaries that had defined her individual existence for 68 years. Memories that weren't her own began flowing through her awareness, glimpses of the entity's existence across eons of imprisonment, its growing understanding of the forces that had trapped it, and its gradual evolution from pure destructive hunger toward something more complex and potentially beneficial, but mixed with the entity's memories were others that seemed to come from her own genetic inheritance. She saw her ancestors working at this same site centuries ago, maintaining the balance through knowledge and techniques that had been carefully preserved across generations. The guardianship hadn't been a burden imposed by fear, but a sacred responsibility willingly accepted by families who understood the true nature of the forces they were helping to transform. "I remember now," she whispered as the flow of ancestral memory continued. "My grandmother's grandmother, she was here. She helped build the original containment system." "Yes," the entity replied, its form now almost human in its proportions, though still composed of that impossible crystallized light. "Your lineage carries the genetic markers that make true guardianship possible. But more than that, it carries the spiritual resonance that allows for partnership rather than domination." The pain of transformation was unlike anything Marla had ever experienced. It felt as if every cell in her body was being taken apart and reassembled according to new specifications, while her consciousness was stretched across dimensions she had no names for. But underlying the physical agony was a sense of rightness, of pieces finally falling into place after a lifetime of not quite fitting together properly. Through her expanding awareness, she could sense the mountain around them, responding to the transformation taking place in the chamber. The wildlife that had fled was beginning to return, drawn by forces they couldn't understand, but recognized as beneficial. The forest itself seemed to be waking from a long sleep, its root systems carrying messages of change and renewal throughout the valley. "The binding is becoming something new," she gasped, as another wave of transformation pain washed through her. "Not containment, but integration. Not prison, but sanctuary." "Yes," the entity said, and its voice now carried warmth that reminded her of summer sunlight and the sound of wind through pine trees. "We are creating something that has never existed before, a place where forces like myself can exist without threatening the world above, where the boundaries between different states of reality can be maintained through cooperation rather than conflict." The artifacts around them began to merge, their individual forms dissolving into streams of light that flowed toward the center of the chamber, where Marla and the entity were becoming something new together. The bronze disc in her hands grew warm and soft, reshaping itself according to patterns that emerged from their shared consciousness. As the transformation reached its peak, Marla felt herself dying and being reborn simultaneously. Her human form was dissolving, but what emerged in its place was something that retained everything essential about who she was, while adding capabilities she could barely comprehend. She was still Marla, still the woman who had learned to find peace in mountain solitude. But she was also something more, a bridge between worlds, a guardian in the truest sense. The entity was changing too, its alien crystalline form taking on aspects that were recognizably terrestrial. It was learning to be part of the mountain ecosystem rather than separate from it, discovering how to use its vast power to nurture rather than consume. "We are bound now," it said, though the distinction between its voice and her own thoughts was becoming increasingly meaningless. Partners in maintaining the balance, guardians of a boundary that no longer needs to be a barrier. The light in the chamber began to soften, transitioning from the harsh blue-white glare that had marked the entity's imprisonment to something warmer and more natural. The impossible dimensions of the space started to resolve into something that still defied normal physics, but felt more welcoming, more like a sanctuary than a prison. When the transformation was complete, Marla found herself standing in a chamber that was both exactly what it had been and completely different. The carved walls still told their stories in symbols that moved and shifted, but now she could read them clearly, understanding the cosmic forces they described and her role in maintaining their balance. The entity stood beside her, no longer alien and threatening, but recognizably part of the same mountain system that had been her home for 30 years. It had retained its vast power and ancient knowledge, but those capabilities were now integrated into the natural order rather than opposed to it. "What happens now?" Marla asked, though she was already beginning to understand the answer through their shared consciousness. "Now we learn together," the entity replied. We discover what it means to be guardians of a place where different forms of existence can coexist. We protect the balance not through containment and sacrifice, but through understanding and cooperation. Marla looked down at her hands and saw that they were still recognizably human, though they now carried traces of the same crystalline light that had once marked the entity as alien. She could feel the mountain around them through senses she hadn't possessed before, aware of every animal, every plant, every geological process within miles of their location. The chamber had become a nexus point, a place where the boundaries between different layers of reality were maintained through conscious intention rather than ancient bindings. It would require ongoing attention, but not the blood sacrifice and fear that had characterized the old system. The others will come eventually, she said, understanding flowing through her enhanced awareness. Other entities like you, other forces that need places where they can exist without threatening the normal world. Yes, the entity agreed, and we will be here to help them find their way to integration rather than conquest. This is what the Guardians were always meant to become, not jailers, but teachers. As they ascended from the chamber together, Marla felt the morning sun on her face and knew that everything had changed while somehow remaining exactly as it should be. The mountain was still her home, but now it was home to something much larger and more wonderful than she had ever imagined possible. The mound above the foundation had reformed during the night, but it was no longer a covering designed to hide something dangerous. It had become a marker, a sign that this place was protected and special without being threatening to those who approached it with respect. Her cabin still stood where she had left it, and her garden still needed tending. But now she understood that her work here had always been part of something larger, and that the solitude she had sought was really a form of service that she had been preparing for her entire life. 6 months after the transformation, Marla sat on her porch in the early morning light, watching deer graze peacefully in the meadow beyond her garden. The animals no longer avoided the area around the reformed mound. Instead, they seemed drawn to it, as if recognizing it as a source of beneficial energy rather than the threat it had once represented. Her daily routines had evolved to accommodate her new responsibilities, but they remained grounded in the practical mountain wisdom she'd developed over 30 years of solitude. She still tended her herb garden, still gathered wild plants according to the seasons, still maintained the careful balance between taking from the land and giving back to it. But now her work carried additional dimensions that reached beyond the purely physical. The chamber beneath, the mound, had become a place of pilgrimage for entities that existed in the spaces between normal reality and human understanding. They came seeking what she and her partner had found: integration rather than exile, cooperation rather than conquest. Some were refugees from other failed containment systems, ancient forces that had been imprisoned for so long they'd forgotten how to exist any other way. Others were newly awakened consciousnesses, born from the intersection of human technology and natural forces in ways that previous generations couldn't have imagined. Marla had become their teacher and guide, helping them navigate the complex process of learning to coexist with a world that was both more fragile and more resilient than most of them understood. The work required patience, wisdom, and occasionally the kind of firm boundaries that reminded her of raising children or training young animals. Not all entities that sought sanctuary were ready for the responsibilities that came with integration, and part of her role was determining when additional time and preparation were needed. The partnership with the entity she'd helped transform had evolved into something deeper than either of them had initially expected. They remained distinct individuals with their own perspectives and capabilities, but they shared a consciousness that allowed them to work together in ways that transcended normal human collaboration. Through their bond, she had access to knowledge that spanned geological ages, while the entity had learned to understand and value the human perspectives that made such knowledge useful rather than merely overwhelming. Elizabeth, from the Pine Ridge Library, had been her first visitor after the transformation, arriving unannounced on an autumn morning when the air carried the scent of changing leaves and wood smoke. The older woman had taken one look at Marla and nodded as if confirming something she'd long suspected. "You look different," Elizabeth had said without preamble. "Older in some ways, younger in others, and there's something in your eyes that wasn't there before, like you're seeing more than the rest of us can." "I am," Marla had replied, and then spent the afternoon explaining what she could about the changes that had taken place on the mountain. Some aspects of her new existence couldn't be adequately described in human language, but Elizabeth had listened with the same careful attention she'd shown to all the old stories she'd collected over the years. "So you're the new guardian," Elizabeth had concluded as the sun set behind the western peaks. "And this place has become something like a sanctuary for forces that need somewhere safe to learn how to be part of the world, instead of threatening it." That's about as close as human words can get to describing it. Marla had agreed. "Good," Elizabeth had said firmly. "The old system was breaking down anyway. Maybe it's time for something better." Since then, Elizabeth had become an unofficial intermediary between Marla's work and the human communities in the valley below. She helped screen the occasional researchers or curiosity seekers who were drawn to investigate reports of unusual phenomena in the mountains, turning away those who might cause problems while guiding the genuinely helpful toward information that might aid their studies. The letters Marla had written before the transformation ritual remained sealed in their metal box, no longer needed as warnings for successors who would never come. Instead, she'd begun keeping a new journal, not just of her personal observations, but of the techniques and insights she was developing for helping other entities find their own paths to integration. Someday, there would be other guardians working at other sites, and they would need guidance for challenges that no previous generation had faced. The mountain itself had become noticeably more alive in the months since the transformation. Plants grew more vibrantly. The water in her stream ran clearer, and the wildlife populations had increased to levels that suggested the entire ecosystem was benefiting from the changes that had taken place. The energy that had once been trapped in destructive patterns was now flowing in ways that supported and enhanced the natural order rather than threatening it. On quiet evenings, when her more unusual responsibilities didn't require immediate attention, Marla would sit in her garden and marvel at the path that had brought her to this place. The woman who had fled to these mountains 30 years ago had been running from pain and failure, seeking nothing more than a place where she could exist without causing or experiencing further harm. But the mountains had been preparing her for something far more significant than simple survival. Every skill she'd developed during her years of solitude, the patience to observe and understand natural systems, the wisdom to work with forces larger than herself, the courage to face challenges that couldn't be solved through conventional means, had been necessary preparation for the role she now filled. The isolation she'd thought was an escape had actually been a form of training, a way of learning to find strength and purpose in circumstances that might have broken someone less prepared. The entity that was now her partner and collaborator had also been changed by their union in ways that went beyond the obvious transformation from imprisoned threat to integrated guardian. Through its connection to her human perspective, it had developed appreciation for concepts like beauty, humor, and the small daily pleasures that made existence meaningful beyond mere survival. In return, her consciousness had been expanded to encompass understandings that reached across cosmic scales of time and space. As winter approached, bringing the first frost to her garden and the familiar rhythms of preparation that marked the turning seasons, Marla reflected on the completeness of her current life. She was no longer the lonely woman who had once wondered if her years in the mountains were just an extended form of hiding from the world. Instead, she had become someone whose work made a difference on scales she was only beginning to understand. The bronze disc that had started her journey toward understanding now hung from a cord around her neck, its symbols no longer mysterious, but familiar as old friends. The obsidian knife rested in a place of honor on her kitchen shelf, its blade still sharp enough to cut through more than physical matter when such cutting was required. The carved staff leaned beside her front door, ready for those occasions when her duties required her to venture beyond the sanctuary to meet with entities that weren't yet ready to approach inhabited areas. Sometimes, on clear nights when the stars seemed close enough to touch, she would stand beside the reformed mound and listen to the deep harmonics that rose from the chamber below. The sounds were no longer the desperate humming of something trapped and hungry, but the complex music of forces in balance, of ancient power that had learned to sing in harmony with the world rather than against it. And in those moments, surrounded by the peace she had helped create and the responsibility she had willingly accepted, Marla understood that she had finally found what she'd been searching for during all those years of solitude. Not escape from the world and its challenges, but a way to engage with them that honored both her own limitations and the vast forces that shaped existence itself. The mountains had given her a home. Now in return, she was helping them become a sanctuary for powers that needed the same healing and integration that had once drawn her to seek refuge in their embrace. It was work that would continue for decades, or perhaps centuries, but it was also work that filled her with the same deep satisfaction she'd once found in her herb garden, the simple, profound pleasure of helping things grow in the directions they were meant to go. Some truths she had learned were indeed buried for reasons, but sometimes those reasons had less to do with keeping dangerous things contained than with waiting for the right moment and the right person to help them transform into something beneficial. The earth had been shifting, just as she'd first sensed when the storm revealed what lay beneath her familiar mountain home. But the shift hadn't been toward destruction. It had been toward a new form of balance that served both the ancient forces that predated human civilization and the fragile communities that had grown up in their shadow, standing in her garden as the first snow of winter began to fall. Marla smiled and went inside to tend the fire that would keep her warm through the long, quiet months ahead. There would be visitors before spring returned, there always were, but tonight was for rest, for gratitude, and for the deep contentment that came from knowing she was exactly where she belonged, doing exactly the work she was meant to do.